My father disowned me for dropping out of his law firm and called me a failure. Now he wants a relationship after finding out what my company is actually worth. The morning my father called to congratulate me, I was sitting in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building he had never been invited to, watching a banker named Quentin Abera slide a term sheet across the table with a number at the top that had 9 figures before the decimal point. My phone buzzed on the glass surface and I saw my father's name, Wallace Osei Mensa, because he had never been dad on my phone, not since I was 16, and understood that the name on the screen was the most accurate representation of who he actually was to me, and I let it go to voicemail. Which was something I had been doing for 3 years, and which had become so practiced it barely registered as a decision anymore. I signed the term sheet. The banker shook my hand with both of his. My co-founder, a woman named Priya Nath, who had been with me since the beginning and who had watched me take more phone calls from my father to voicemail than either of us could count, caught my eye across the table and smiled the smile of someone who had been waiting a long time for a particular morning to arrive. I drove home through the ordinary city and ate a sandwich, standing at my kitchen counter and thought, for the first time in a long time, about the day my father had stood in his office doorway and told me I was throwing away everything he had built. I had been working at Osei Mensa and Partners for 14 months when it ended. My father had founded the firm 26 years earlier, built it from a single-room practice in an office park into a 30-attorney operation that handled corporate litigation for mid-size regional companies. And he had spent most of my childhood making clear that the firm's continuation in the family was not a preference but a plan. The kind of plan you don't discuss so much as absorb. The way you absorb the assumption that gravity works and winter follows autumn. I had gone to law school because the alternative, in the household I grew up in, required a kind of sustained argument I didn't have the resources for at 18, and because some part of me had believed, for longer than I care to admit, that the plan might turn out to be something I actually wanted. My mother, a quiet woman named Adais, who had spent 30 years making space for my father's certainty, had suggested gently when I was in my second year of law school that it was not too late to change direction. I had not listened. I was still trying to find the version of myself that fit inside his expectations, which is a project that consumes enormous amounts of time before you understand it is structurally impossible. The 14 months at the firm had been the final experiment. By the end, I knew 2 things with absolute clarity. I wasn't suited to corporate litigation, and I had an idea for a software platform that I could not stop thinking about. The platform addressed a specific problem in the legal services industry: document automation and AI-assisted contract analysis for smaller firms that couldn't afford enterprise-level tools. I had been thinking about it since my second year of law school, had spent 18 months doing research on the side, had talked to Priya about it for the first time at a conference where she was presenting on legal tech trends, and I was a third-year associate trying to look like I belonged. She had the technical background I didn't. I had the industry knowledge she lacked. We had lunch twice after that conference, and by the end of the second lunch, we had the rough architecture of a business plan on the back of a receipt from a Thai restaurant that I still have somewhere in a drawer. What I didn't have was the ability to do this while also fulfilling my obligations at the firm, which was something I discovered over the course of about 6 months of trying to do both and doing neither well. The decision to leave took 3 weeks of serious internal negotiation and ended on a Wednesday morning when I walked into my father's office at 8:15 a.m. and told him I was resigning. I had prepared for various versions of this conversation. I had not adequately prepared for his face. He didn't shout. My father rarely shouted because he had found, over a career built on controlled presentation, that measured coldness was more effective than volume. He looked at me for a long moment and then he asked, in the tone he used for witnesses he was about to dismantle on cross-examination, whether I understood what I was throwing away. I said I did. He said I clearly did not because no person who understood it would make this choice. He said I was walking away from his life's work for a technology idea that I had not tested, on in a market I did not understand, with a partner I had known for 8 months. He said he had spent 26 years building something I could inherit and grow, and I was choosing to hand it back. And then he said the thing I have returned to many times since. Not because it hurt, but because of what it revealed about the structure of his regard. He said that if I walked out of his firm, I was walking out of his life, and that he would not be available to me when the idea failed, which it would, and which I would have to sit with alone because I had chosen that. He said, "You are not the son I raised." I said, "I know." and I left. The first 2 years were hard in the specific way that building something from zero is hard, and not dramatically, not cinematically, but with the grinding, incremental difficulty of a process that requires you to make hundreds of small decisions correctly while living on a budget that required tracking every expense in a spreadsheet and eating a lot of food that prioritized caloric density over quality. Priya and I had raised a seed round of $420,000 from two angel investors, a woman named Constance Wyeth, a retired legal tech executive with 20 years in the industry, and a man named Roshan Pillai, who ran a small venture fund that specialized in B2B software. Neither of them had given us money because they were confident we would succeed. They had given us money because the problem was real, and our understanding of it was specific, and our unit economics, even at the seed stage, had a plausibility that some pitches don't have. Constance, in particular, was invaluable in those early months. She had seen every version of this mistake and every version of this success, and she had the quality of someone who told you what she actually thought, which was sometimes uncomfortable and always useful. She told us at our first post-investment meeting that most companies at our stage failed because they built the right product for the wrong customer, and that we should spend the first 6 months in customer interviews, not in development. We did exactly that. It probably saved us. My mother called me during this period, occasionally and carefully in the way she had learned to operate around my father's positions without directly challenging them. She never said she disagreed with his decision. She never said she thought he was wrong. What she did was call on Sunday evenings to ask how I was eating and whether I was sleeping enough, which in the language of our family was its own form of allegiance. I did not tell her how hard things were because I knew it would reach him through channels I couldn't control, and I did not want him to have the satisfaction of accurate information about my difficulties. This was probably not my most mature period. I was 31 years old and building a company and conducting my relationship with my family through careful information management, which is a thing you do when the alternative is too costly to consider. My father did not call, not once, in 2 years, and I had half expected him to break in some moment of softness and had prepared a version of myself for that call that was ready to receive it without collapsing into either gratitude or resentment. The call never came. After a while, I stopped preparing for it. The company was called Lexara. The product was a contract intelligence platform that allowed mid-sized law firms to automate document drafting, extract key clauses from incoming contracts, and flag risk patterns using a machine learning model we had trained on a dataset that Priya spent 14 months building from publicly available legal filings and licensed document libraries. By the end of year 2, we had 43 paying customers and annualized revenue of $1.2 million. By the end of year 3, revenue had grown to $8.4 million, and we had 180 customers across 12 states. The growth had not been graceful. We had made 3 significant product decisions I still consider mistakes, had a key engineering hire leave in year 2 under circumstances that required a difficult internal investigation, and had a period of 4 months in late year 2 where our customer acquisition cost was so high relative to lifetime value that I was having weekly conversations with Roshan about whether we needed to restructure. We didn't, partly because Priya rebuilt our pricing model in 6 weeks in a way that corrected the unit economics, and partly because a large regional law firm in Atlanta signed a contract in month 31 that was worth $640,000 annually and functioned as proof of concept for the enterprise tier we had been building toward. That contract changed the trajectory. By year 4, we were profitable, which in B2B software at our stage was not common, and we had begun receiving acquisition interest from 2 of the larger legal tech platforms. That interest was what triggered the Series B process, which was what produced the term sheet from Quentin Abera's firm, which was what my father had apparently read about in a trade publication before he called. The acquisition conversation had become public in a controlled way. We had worked with a PR firm to time a story in a legal industry publication about Lexara's growth metrics, which was designed to run 2 weeks before the Series B closed and create the kind of momentum that helped term sheet negotiations. The story had numbers in it, specific, sourced numbers. My father had apparently seen the story. He called on a Thursday morning. I was in the conference room. I let it go to voicemail. That evening, I was at my apartment, which was a 2-bedroom in a neighborhood I had moved to in year 3 when the company's trajectory made longer-term planning possible. And I listened to the voicemail for the first time. His voice had the quality of a man who had prepared what he wanted to say and was executing the preparation. He said he had read about Lexara and was proud of what I had built. He said he had been thinking about me and thought it was time to reconnect. He said he knew things had been left in a difficult place and that he thought, at this stage, it would be good for both of us to talk. He said he hoped I was well and to call him when I had a chance. He said, "I've missed you, son." The last sentence was the only one that sounded unrehearsed, and I wasn't sure whether its lack of rehearsal made it more or less true. I sat with the voicemail for about 10 minutes, and then I called Priya. Priya had met my father once at an industry event 2 years into the company where he had appeared unexpectedly because a client of the firm had invited him, and nobody had thought to check the attendee list. The interaction had lasted approximately 4 minutes. My father had shaken her hand and asked a few questions about the company with the surface manner of someone being politely curious. And when he left, Priya had turned to me and said, with the directness that made her the right person to build something hard with, "He's checking on you, not on the company. He wanted to see if you were struggling." I had already known this. Having someone say it plainly had helped. And when I called her after listening to the voicemail, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "What do you want to do?" I said I didn't know. She said, "Yes, you do." I sat with that. I called my therapist the next morning. Her name was Dr. Amara Tete, a clinical psychologist with 16 years in practice who specialized in family dynamics and high-stress professional environments. And I had been seeing her for 2 years at the recommendation of Constance Wyeth, who had told me flatly at the start of year 3 that company founders who didn't have a structured place to process their internal experience made worse decisions, and that this was not a theory but an observation she had made across 15 investments. Doctor! Teta had the quality of someone who asked questions that pointed toward what you already knew rather than toward what she wanted you to think. When I told her about the voicemail, she asked how I had felt listening to it. I said, like I was being evaluated. She said, "For what?" I said, "To see if I was still worth reconnecting with." She said, "And is that different from how you felt when you left the firm?" I said, "No." She said, "So the metric changed, but the dynamic didn't." I sat with that for the rest of the session and through most of the week that followed. I did not call him back for 12 days. In those 12 days, 3 things happened that clarified the situation in ways that made the eventual conversation harder than I had been preparing for. The first was that my mother called me on a Sunday evening in her usual way, but this time the call was longer than usual and had a different texture. She asked about the Series B, and I confirmed that it was closing. She said she was proud and that she had been following the company from a distance, which I already knew because she had told me this in indirect ways over the years. And then she said carefully, "Your father is going to reach out if he hasn't already." I said he had. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "He's been different since he read the article." I said, "Different how?" She said, "He keeps the article on his desk. He showed it to the partners. He said your name in a sentence with pride last week." I said, "I understood." She said, "I don't want you to be hurt again." She said it in the tone of someone who had seen the hurt the first time and had carried a version of it herself and was now trying to hand me something protective without being able to name it precisely. I thanked her and we talked for another 20 minutes about other things, and when I hung up, I sat in my kitchen and thought about my father showing the article to his partners and felt something I did not immediately have a word for. It was not anger. It was something more like the specific grief of a thing you had wanted for a long time, arriving in a form that wasn't the thing you had wanted. The second thing was that Roshan called me with information I had not expected. He had run into my father at a dinner connected to a regional bar association event. Roshan had investment interests in a law firm and sometimes attended legal industry social functions. And my father had introduced himself and mentioned that I was his son. Roshan, who knew the full history because I had told him during a late night in year 2 when the company was in its difficult period and I was less guarded than usual, had been cordial and professional. But he had noticed something. He said, "Your father asked me how the company was doing. Not how you were, how the company was." He asked about the Series B valuation. He asked about the acquisition interest. He said he was trying to understand the full picture. I sat with this. Roshan said he was telling me because he thought I should know what questions were being asked before I decided how to respond to the voicemail. He said, "He's doing due diligence on his own kid." I said, "That's just how he operates." Roshan said, "I know, that's why I'm calling." He was a good investor. More than that, he had become someone I trusted, which was not a category I expanded easily. The third thing was a conversation with my corporate attorney, a woman named Beatrice Asante, who had represented Lixara since the seed round and who had 14 years of experience in technology transactions and corporate law. Beatrice called to walk me through the final structure of the Series B close and mentioned, with the matter-of-fact precision I valued in her, that my father's firm had filed a brief in a case that was tangentially connected to one of our investor entities. Nothing that created a conflict, nothing that required action, but something she had flagged because she believed in comprehensive disclosure. She said she had no reason to think it was anything other than coincidence. She paused, then she said, "I did want you to know, just in case." I asked if she thought it was coincidence. She said, "I think your father is a thorough man who doesn't do things without intention." I said, "Yes." She said, "I'll keep watching." I thanked her and we moved on to the term sheet details. But the conversation stayed with me in the specific way that information stays with you when it confirms a pattern you had suspected, but had not yet been able to name. I called my father on a Thursday evening, 14 days after his voicemail from my home office with the door closed and a notebook in front of me that I had not written anything in but which made me feel more organized than I was. He answered on the second ring, which told me he had been expecting the call and had his phone close. He said, "Kweku." My name and his voice after 3 years had a quality I had not anticipated. It was familiar in a way that bypassed the constructed distance I had built, hitting something that lived below the rational level, something that remembered being small and wanting him to be what he occasionally was, which was formidable and brilliant and capable of a specific type of warm attention that he rationed in a way that made the receipt of it feel significant. I said, "Wallace." He paused. He said, "You can still call me Dad." I said, "I know." Whoa, there was a moment of silence that contained everything that had happened since the Wednesday morning in his office doorway. Then we talked for 45 minutes. The conversation had two layers, the one on the surface and the one underneath, and I was tracking both simultaneously, which was exhausting in the specific way of conversations with people who operate strategically. The surface layer was warmth and expressed pride and the language of reconnection. He said he had always believed in me, which was technically true only if you understood believed in as something he had not felt any obligation to express. He said the article had made him realize how much he had missed. He said he wanted to see me. The layer underneath had a different texture. Twice he asked questions about Lexara's current valuation. Once he asked about the acquisition conversations. He asked who the lead investors were in the Series B. He asked what the company's path looked like over the next 3 years. I answered everything accurately because I had decided before the call that I would tell the truth and watch what he did with it. I met with Dr. Tete the day after the call. I told her both layers. She listened the whole way through and then asked, "What would it mean to you if his interest was genuine?" I said, "It would mean I had a father again." She said, "And what would it mean if it wasn't?" I said, "It would mean that the number on the term sheet was the thing that changed his mind and not me." She said, "Can both be true?" I sat with that. She said, "I'm not asking you to decide which it is. I'm asking you to decide what you need before you let him back in." I thought about this for several days. I talked to Priya about it over lunch at a place we had been going to since year one, the kind of restaurant that had become associated in my mind with the serious conversations of building the company. And she said something that was simpler than Dr. Teta's formulation, but arrived at the same place. "Whatever he wants, you have the company either way. It's yours. That doesn't change based on what he does next." I wrote that down in the notebook that had been empty since the phone call. It helped. My father asked to visit Lixara's offices. The request came in a text message 3 days after our call, phrased as curiosity. "I'd love to see what you've built." I stared at the text for a long time. Yeah, the office was real and tangible in a way that the number on the term sheet wasn't. It was 42 people working in a space that reflected 3.5 years of decisions, a physical embodiment of the thing I had chosen over his firm, and the idea of him walking through it had a complicated weight. I talked to Beatrice before responding. I said, "Is there any legal reason I should or shouldn't have him visit?" She said no, that it was entirely my decision, but that I should be aware that the Series B close had not yet been announced publicly, and that anything discussed in that context should be treated as material non-public information. I said I understood. She said, If he asks anything that feels like it's building towards something, document it. I appreciated her precision. I always had. He came on a Wednesday morning 3 weeks after our phone call. He arrived in a dark gray suit that I recognized as the kind he wore to important meetings, not casual visits, which told me what category he had placed this in. He was 61 years old and looked it in the particular way that powerful men who have not had much cause for self-doubt look it, solid and still largely certain, with the specific quality of someone who had spent a career being the most authoritative person in most rooms and had not yet encountered a room that sufficiently recalibrated that. Priya met him at reception with me, which I had arranged deliberately. My father shook her hand and said he had heard a lot about her, which was technically accurate, only if you counted reading the article because I had not told him anything about her. Now, Priya smiled and said it was good to meet him. Her eyes did not say this, but her face did, which is one of the things I had always respected about her. I walked him through the office. He asked good questions. He was a trained examiner, and his questions were incisive in a way that I recognized from watching him work when I was young, and had admired him without yet understanding the cost of that admiration. He asked about the machine learning model's training data. He asked about customer retention metrics. He asked about the legal basis for our IP protections. The questions were not the questions of a proud father learning about his son's work. They were the questions of a sophisticated evaluator conducting an assessment. I answered all of them. Partway through the tour, he stopped at a wall in our main workspace where we had kept a timeline of the company's milestones. The first customer, the first profitable month, the Atlanta contract, the Series B announcement, and a few photographs from different stages. He looked at the timeline for a long moment and then he said, "You did all of this after I told you it wouldn't work." He said it in a tone I could not cleanly identify. I said, "Yes." He said, "I was wrong about the idea." He paused. He said, "I may have been wrong about some other things." I looked at him and thought about 12 days of silence before calling him back, and about Roshan's phone call, and about the questions he had just asked while walking through my office. I thought about my mother's voice saying, "I don't want you to be hurt again." I thought about the word failure, and which was what he had called me in his office doorway, and which I had carried without fully acknowledging how heavy it was for longer than I should have. I said, "That's a careful way to say it." He looked at me. He said, "What would you prefer?" I said, "I'd prefer to know what you actually want." The silence that followed that question had the quality of a thing being opened that had been closed for a long time. My father looked at the timeline on the wall and then at me and then at the floor, which was the first time I had ever seen him look at the floor in a conversation with me. He said, "I want to be your father." He said, "I want to know you." And then he said, "I also want to be honest with you." He said he had been thinking about the firm's succession in a way he hadn't before he read the article. He said the acquisition interest we had received had made him think about whether there were partnership or investment structures that could benefit both sides. He said he wasn't asking for anything specific and that he understood it was early and that the most important thing was the relationship. He said both things in the same conversation, the personal and the strategic. And I understood finally and completely that this was the only way he knew how to operate. That for him, the two categories were not separable, that the relationship and the utility existed in the same space, and he did not know how to want one without the other. It was not manipulation, exactly. It was more like limitation, a fundamental constraint on how he experienced value. I stood in my own office looking at my father and felt something that contained grief and clarity in equal parts. I called Beatrice from the car after he left. I said, "I need to document something." She said, "Tell me." I walked her through the conversation in detail, including the questions about the business and the succession comment and the investment partnership mention. She was quiet when I finished. She said, "He didn't make a proposal." I said, "No." She said, "But you want a record of the conversation before he does?" I said, "Yes." She said she would make a contemporaneous note in the file and that if anything more specific was proposed, I should bring it to her immediately before responding. She said, "I want to be clear that you're under no obligation to consider any business arrangement with anyone, including family, during or after the Series B close." I said I knew. She said, "I'm saying it because sometimes people need to hear it from a lawyer to believe it's true." I thanked her and drove the rest of the way home in a silence that felt different from the silences I had lived in for 3 years, more inhabited, more like something that was being thought through than something being avoided. The Series B closed 11 days later at a pre-money valuation of $180 million. Lexera was worth a number my 28-year-old self, eating calorie-dense food and tracking expenses in a spreadsheet, could not have rendered accurately in his imagination. Priya and I sat in Beatrice's conference room and signed documents for 3 hours and then went to the Thai restaurant near her office, where we had first sketched the business plan on a receipt and ate too much of the same food and talked about the first 2 years in the way you can only talk about something hard after it's become safe to be honest, about how hard it was. She said, "Do you know what the best day was?" I said, "Tell me." She said, "The day you walked out of your father's firm." I looked at her across the table. She said, "Not because it led to this, because you chose yourself. Everything after was just consequence." I thought about that for a long time afterward. My father called to congratulate me the morning after the announcement, in which had gone out through the standard wire services and had been picked up by several legal industry publications and 2 general tech outlets. The call was warm and specific and had none of the evaluation quality of the office visit. He said the right things. He said he was proud. He said he loved me, which was a sentence I had not heard from him in 3 years and which arrived with the strange double quality of things that are both true and also complicated. True in itself and complicated by its timing. I thanked him. I did not say I loved him back, not because I didn't, but because I needed to earn the ground to say it on first, which would take more conversations than the ones we had had so far. He said he hoped we could have dinner soon. I said I would be in touch about that. He said, "Take your time." I said, "I will." And I meant it, in a way that was not unkind but was honest, which is the only kind of meaning I was interested in now. Dr. Tete asked me at our next session what I was going to do about my father. I said, "I'm going to take him at his word for now and watch his actions." She said, "And if the actions and the words don't match?" I said, "Then I'll have the clarity I need." She said, "That sounds like a plan built by someone who knows the difference between forgiving someone and trusting them." I said, "I've had 3 years to learn the difference." She smiled briefly, the specific smile of a therapist who considers a patient's growth objectively and allows herself a moment to register it. I drove home and made coffee and sat at my kitchen counter in the apartment that the company had made possible and thought about my father in his office doorway, and about the term sheet on the table, and about Priya saying everything after was just consequence, and about the article sitting on my father's desk in his office 20 miles away, my name in ink, the numbers beside it, the story they told to a man who had called me a failure and had now, in the specific and insufficient way that was available to him, been shown what failure actually looked like. It looked nothing like me. It never had.